The wind carried voices from the canyon. The rancher opened the door, and 13 natives entered. The coffee had gone cold 3 hours ago, but Marcus Hayes still gripped the tin cup like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to this world. Through the cracked window of his cabin, the Arizona desert stretched endlessly, painted in shades of copper and gold by the dying sun. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones, the way his grandfather used to predict storms. The cattle had been restless all week, refusing to graze near the southern pasture. His horse, Thunder, kept pawing at the ground and snorting toward the canyon that split his land like a jagged wound. Even the coyotes had gone silent, and in this God-forsaken stretch of territory, silence meant trouble. Marcus set down the cup and reached for his Winchester. The metal felt familiar in his weathered hands, worn smooth by 20 years of frontier life. He had bought this land with blood money, compensation for losing his left eye to a Comanche arrow during his army days. The scar that ran from his temple to his jaw served as a daily reminder of how quickly fortune could change in the West. The wind picked up, carrying something unusual across the desert floor. Voices. Not the howling of coyotes or the whistle of air through rock formations, but human voices speaking in a language that made his remaining eye narrow with recognition and dread. Apache. Marcus limped to the door, his right leg protesting with each step. The old war wound always acted up when the weather changed, and tonight felt different, electric, dangerous. His fingers found the brass doorknob, hesitating for a moment that stretched like eternity. 20 years ago, he would have reached for his sidearm first and asked questions later. But 2 decades of solitary ranch life had taught him patience, and the voices carried no war cries, no battle songs. They sounded almost ceremonial. The door creaked open on rusted hinges, and Marcus stepped onto his porch. The wooden boards groaned under his weight, a sound that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. Before him stood 13 figures, their faces painted with white clay and ochre, their bodies draped in traditional Apache clothing that seemed to shimmer in the twilight. The leader stepped forward, an elderly man whose face was mapped with lines that spoke of decades spent under the unforgiving desert sun. His eyes, dark as obsidian, held no hostility, only an ancient weariness that Marcus recognized in his own reflection. "We come in peace, White Eyes," the old Apache said in broken English, his voice carrying the weight of mountains. "The spirits have spoken. The earth bleeds, and only you can stop it." Marcus tightened his grip on the Winchester but did not raise it. In his years on the frontier, he had learned to read men like weather patterns, and these Apache carried themselves with the dignity of those who came bearing truth rather than war. "What do you want?" Marcus asked, his voice rougher than he intended. The desert had a way of stealing moisture from everything, including conversation. The Apache elder gestured toward the canyon, where shadows were gathering like dark water. "Your land sits on sacred ground. The white man's machines have awakened something that should sleep. We offer alliance, rancher. Join us, or watch your cattle die and your water turn to blood." Marcus had heard rumors from the neighboring town of Copper Ridge about strange occurrences. Cattle found dead without wounds, water wells running dry overnight, and travelers speaking of lights in the canyon that moved against the wind. He had dismissed them as frontier superstition, the kind of stories that grew like tumbleweeds in isolated communities. But looking at these 13 Apache, their faces serious as tombstones, Marcus felt the familiar chill of approaching danger. It was the same sensation he had experienced before every major battle during his army days, when the air itself seemed to hold its breath. "What kind of machines?" he asked, lowering his rifle slightly. The elder's expression darkened. "The railroad men. They dig deep, seeking passage through sacred rock. They have broken the seal that keeps the old hunger sleeping. Already it stirs. Already it feeds." Marcus thought of his cattle, how they had refused to drink from the creek that ran through the canyon, how Thunder had thrown him last week when he tried to ride the familiar trail to check the southern fence line, how the desert, usually alive with the sounds of small creatures, had fallen into an unnatural quiet. "What do you propose?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. The Apache elder smiled, revealing teeth stained brown by years of chewing medicinal roots. "We know the old ways. You know the white man's ways. Together we stop what comes before it grows too strong to contain." The other 12 Apache remained silent, but Marcus could feel their eyes upon him, measuring his character like merchants evaluating precious metal. These were not the war parties that had once terrorized the frontier. These were medicine men, keepers of knowledge that stretched back generations. "How do I know you're not planning to scalp me the moment I turn my back?" Marcus asked, though his tone carried more curiosity than accusation. The elder reached into a leather pouch and withdrew a small object that gleamed in the fading light. It was a military button, tarnished with age, but still recognizable as belonging to the United States Cavalry. Marcus recognized it immediately. It had been torn from his uniform during the battle where he lost his eye. "You fought with honor, Marcus Hayes. You could have killed our wounded, but you did not. The spirits remember. We remember." The rancher stared at the button, memories flooding back like water through a broken dam. The Battle of Apache Pass, where he had found a young Apache brave bleeding out behind a boulder. Instead of finishing him, Marcus had bandaged the wound and given him water. It had been an act of impulse, born from exhaustion rather than mercy, but apparently it had been witnessed. "That brave was my grandson," the elder continued. "He lives still, thanks to your kindness. Now we repay the debt." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding the weight of Apache honor. In their culture, debts were not forgotten, even across decades. He gestured for the group to follow him inside, knowing that this decision would change everything. The interior of his cabin was sparse but functional. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel decorated with the few possessions he valued. A photograph of his parents, a medal from his army service, and a pair of silver spurs that had belonged to his father. The Apache filed in silently, their movements fluid and purposeful. "Coffee's cold, but I can heat it up," Marcus offered, already moving toward the kitchen area. "We do not drink the white man's bitter water," the elder replied, though his tone held no judgment. "But we accept the gesture." As Marcus rekindled the fire, the elder began to speak in his native tongue to the other Apache. The words flowed like water over stones, rhythmic and hypnotic. Marcus caught fragments, words he had learned during his army days, enough to understand they were discussing strategy. "The thing that stirs," the elder said, switching back to English. "It is old hunger. Older than Apache, older than white man. It feeds on fear and grows strong on blood. The railroad men have torn open its prison, thinking only of profit." Marcus poured himself a fresh cup of coffee, the bitter liquid providing comfort in the growing darkness. "What exactly are we dealing with? Some kind of animal?" The elder shook his head, his expression grave. "Not animal, not spirit, something between. In the old stories, we call it the devourer. It takes the shape of what men fear most, grows stronger with each feeding. Left unchecked, it will consume everything in its path." Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows of the cabin. Marcus could hear something else now, a low rumbling that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. His cattle, usually settled by this time of evening, were lowing in distress. "It's already started, hasn't it?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. The elder nodded. "The signs are clear. Dead cattle with no wounds. Water that tastes of copper and fear. Workers from the railroad camp who disappear in the night, leaving only their clothes and the smell of sulfur." Marcus set down his coffee cup and walked to the window. In the distance, he could see lights moving through the canyon, not the steady glow of lanterns, but something that pulsed and writhed like a living thing. The sight sent ice through his veins. "What's your plan?" he asked, turning back to the Apache. The elder reached into another pouch and withdrew a collection of items, sage bundles, painted stones, and what looked like silver bullets. "We perform the old ritual, bind the hunger back to its prison. But we need someone who understands the white man's ways, someone who can get close to the railroad camp without suspicion." Marcus understood immediately. The railroad workers would never trust a group of Apache, especially not with the recent tensions over land rights. But a local rancher, someone who had lived in the area for years, might be able to walk among them without raising alarm. "When do we start?" he asked. The elder smiled. "At dawn. The hunger is strongest in darkness, but the binding ritual requires sunlight. We will need to move carefully. Stay together. The devourer can sense our intentions now that we have gathered." As if summoned by his words, a sound echoed across the desert, a roar that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. The cabin shook, and Marcus felt his teeth rattle. Outside, his cattle were in full panic, their bellowing mixing with the unnatural sound from the canyon. Sweet Jesus, Marcus breathed, reaching for his rifle again. The elder placed a weathered hand on his arm. It knows we are here. It knows we plan to fight. From this moment forward, we are all in danger. The other Apache had begun to chant, their voices weaving together in harmonies that seemed to push back against the malevolent sound from the canyon. Marcus felt the hair on his arm stand up, as if the very air was charged with opposing forces. "What do I need to do?" he asked. The elder handed him one of the painted stones. It was warm to the touch, and Marcus could feel a subtle vibration running through it. "Keep this close. It will protect you from the hunger's influence. Tomorrow, we ride to the railroad camp. You will distract the workers while we prepare the ritual site." Marcus nodded, pocketing the stone. "And if something goes wrong?" The elder's expression was grave. "Then we die fighting, and the hunger spreads until it consumes all the West. There is no middle ground in this battle, rancher. We succeed, or everything ends." The night passed slowly, filled with unnatural sounds and the constant awareness of being watched. Marcus dozed fitfully in his chair, the Winchester across his lap, while the Apache maintained their vigil. Several times he woke to find one of them standing at a window, their face painted with concentration as they whispered protective words. Dawn came like a blessing, painting the desert in shades of rose and gold. The malevolent presence that had pressed against the cabin all night seemed to retreat with the darkness, though Marcus could still feel it lurking in the depths of the canyon. "It is time," the elder announced, rising from his cross-legged position near the fireplace. The Apache filed out of the cabin, their movements purposeful and coordinated. Marcus followed, checking his weapons and supplies. The painted stone in his pocket felt warm against his leg, a constant reminder of the supernatural forces at play. They rode toward the railroad camp in silence, the Apache on their painted ponies, Marcus on Thunder. The morning air was crisp and clean, but underneath it, Marcus could detect the faint smell of sulfur and decay that seemed to emanate from the canyon. The railroad camp was a collection of tents and temporary structures clustered around the mouth of the canyon. Steam-powered equipment sat idle, and Marcus could see workers moving about their morning routines. They looked tired, their faces drawn with exhaustion and something else, fear. "Remember," the elder said quietly, "keep them focused on you. Give us time to reach the sacred site." Marcus nodded and rode forward, leaving the Apache concealed behind a rock formation. As he approached the camp, several workers looked up, their expressions a mixture of relief and suspicion. "Morning, boys," Marcus called out, dismounting near the largest tent. "Heard you folks have been having some trouble out here." A burly man with a foreman's bearing approached, his face lined with worry. "Marcus Hayes, isn't it? Got the spread up north?" "That's right," Marcus replied, keeping his voice casual. "Been hearing stories in town about strange happenings. Thought I'd ride out and see if you needed any help." The foreman laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Help? Mister, unless you know how to fight demons, I don't think there's much you can do. We've lost 6 men in the past week, just vanished, like they never existed." Marcus felt the stone in his pocket pulse with warmth. "What kind of demons?" The foreman glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. "The kind that make sounds like your dead mother calling for help. The kind that leave claw marks in solid stone. We're pulling out tomorrow, soon as we can pack up the equipment." "That's probably wise," Marcus agreed, though inwardly he knew that running wouldn't solve anything. If the Apache elder was right, the hunger would only grow stronger and follow them. As he spoke with the foreman, Marcus caught glimpses of the Apache moving through the canyon, their forms barely visible among the rocks and shadows. They were positioning themselves around what looked like a natural amphitheater, the walls carved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Marcus learning more about the railroad's blasting operations and the strange discoveries they had made. Deep in the canyon, they had found a chamber filled with bones, not human or animal, but something altogether different. The workers had assumed they were fossil remains, but the Apache elder would know them for what they truly were, the remains of the devourer's previous meals. "There," the foreman said, pointing toward the canyon mouth. That's where we first heard the sounds. Started right after we blasted through that rock wall. Marcus nodded, keeping his expression neutral even as his stomach churned. The Apache had been right. The railroad workers had unknowingly opened a prison that had held something terrible for centuries. A commotion near the canyon entrance caught their attention. One of the workers was shouting, pointing toward the rock walls where the Apache were conducting their ritual. Marcus could see smoke rising from several locations, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with heat. "What the hell is that?" the foreman demanded. Marcus was ready with his answer. "Brush fire, probably. This dry weather makes everything tinder. We should probably move the equipment back, just to be safe." The foreman bought the explanation, calling for his men to relocate the steam engines and supplies. As they worked, Marcus positioned himself to watch the Apache ritual unfold. The 13 figures had formed a circle around the amphitheater, their chanting audible even over the noise of the camp. The painted stones they had placed around the perimeter began to glow with a soft, warm light. Marcus felt the stone in his pocket respond, growing almost hot against his leg. The air in the canyon began to vibrate, and he could hear something answering from deep within the earth, a sound of rage and hunger that made his teeth ache. "You hear that?" one of the workers asked, his voice tight with fear. "Just the wind," Marcus replied, though he knew it was a lie. The sound was growing stronger, more focused, as if something massive was stirring in the depths of the canyon. The Apache elder raised his arms, and his voice carried across the camp as he spoke in his native tongue. The words seemed to have physical weight, pressing against Marcus's chest like a heavy blanket. The other Apache responded in unison, their voices weaving together in a pattern that seemed to push back against the malevolent presence. Then the ground began to shake. It started as a subtle tremor, barely noticeable beneath the bustle of the camp, but within moments, it had grown to a full earthquake that sent workers stumbling and equipment toppling. Marcus grabbed the foreman's arm, steadying him as the earth rolled beneath their feet. "Earthquake!" someone shouted, though Marcus knew it was something far worse. The shaking intensified, and from the depths of the canyon came a roar that seemed to split the very air. It was a sound of pure rage and hunger, the cry of something that had been bound for centuries and was now fighting against its chains. The Apache continued their chanting, their voices never wavering even as the ground bucked and rolled beneath them. Marcus could see the strain on their faces, the tremendous effort required to maintain the ritual against such overwhelming opposition. "We need to get out of here," the foreman shouted over the noise. But Marcus stood his ground, knowing that running would only ensure the Devourer's victory. The painted stone in his pocket was burning hot now, and he could feel its power flowing through him, giving him strength and clarity. The earthquake reached its peak, and for a moment, Marcus thought the very canyon walls would collapse. Then, suddenly, the Apache elder's voice rose above all other sounds, speaking words in a language older than human memory. The painted stones around the amphitheater blazed with brilliant light, and the air itself seemed to catch fire. The roar from the depths changed pitch, becoming something like a scream of defeat. The earthquake began to subside, and the malevolent presence that had pressed against Marcus's mind all night started to retreat. But the battle was not over. From the deepest part of the canyon, something began to emerge. Marcus caught only glimpses of it through the smoke and dust, something that seemed to be made of shadow and hunger, with eyes like burning coals and claws that could tear through stone. The Devourer, fighting its way toward freedom even as the Apache ritual sought to bind it. "Mother of God," the foreman whispered, his face pale with terror. The Apache elder's voice rose to a crescendo, and the other 12 joined him in a final, overwhelming chant. The painted stones exploded with light, and Marcus felt the stone in his pocket crack from the heat. The Devourer's scream of rage echoed across the desert, and then, suddenly, there was silence. The smoke began to clear, revealing the canyon mouth sealed with what looked like solid stone. The Apache had collapsed from exhaustion, but they were alive, their faces marked with the satisfaction of victory. Marcus helped the foreman to his feet, both men staring at the transformed landscape. Where the railroad's excavation had been, there was now only smooth rock, as if the canyon had healed itself. "What just happened?" the foreman asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus looked at the Apache elder, who was slowly rising to his feet. The old man nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement and respect. "Justice," Marcus replied. "Justice for the dead, and protection for the living." The foreman stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. "I think it's time we packed up and moved on. This land wasn't meant for railroads." As the workers began to break camp, Marcus walked over to where the Apache were gathering their ritual items. The painted stones had turned to ash, their power spent in the great binding. "Is it over?" Marcus asked. The elder nodded, though his expression remained serious. "The hunger sleeps again, bound by the old words and the new alliance, but it will not sleep forever. Others will come seeking to exploit this land. When they do, the alliance must be renewed." Marcus understood. This was not an ending, but a beginning. The bond forged between him and the Apache in this desert canyon would need to be maintained, passed down through generations, to ensure that the devourer remained bound. "I'll be ready," he promised. The elder smiled and placed a weathered hand on Marcus's shoulder. "The spirits chose well, rancher. The land is safe, and the debt is paid." As the Apache rode away into the desert, Marcus mounted Thunder and began the ride back to his ranch. The cattle were grazing peacefully now, the unnatural silence replaced by the familiar sounds of desert life. The crisis had passed, but the responsibility would remain. That evening, as he sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, Marcus could hear the wind carrying new sounds across the desert. Not voices of warning, but songs of celebration. The Apache were honoring their victory, and the land itself seemed to breathe easier. The railroad would find another route, one that did not disturb sacred ground. The workers would spread stories of the earthquake and the strange events, but few would believe them. The truth would be kept by those who needed to know, passed down through Apache oral tradition, and in the memories of one scarred rancher. Marcus touched the cracked stone in his pocket, feeling its residual warmth. Tomorrow he would begin learning the Apache ways, understanding the signs that would warn of future threats. The frontier was changing, but some responsibilities transcended the boundaries between cultures. As the stars emerged in the desert sky, Marcus Hayes settled back in his chair and prepared for a long watch. The wind carried no voices now, only the peaceful sounds of a land protected by unlikely allies and ancient wisdom. The devourer slept, and the West was safe, for now.